just so the audience is aware, in case we make a comment on something that happened a few seconds ago. It's because there is a delay.
This should be say, Finn is in Facebook jail, so he can't comment. So if you have a question, he has to answer it.
And, of course, thank you, everybody in internet world, all 3 people who are watching right now, for joining us for the Q&A. We want to just go around the room and introduce ourselves.
Yeah.
I'm Vienno. I am the host of the podcast Trans Field Guide. Finn?
Oh, I am Finn Jones.
Right there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Finn. I am one of the co-founders and executive director of Trans-Cendence International, and I'm a trans guy.
I'm JD. I am the newest board member to Trans-Cendence International. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker.
And how do you identify?
And I identify as genderqueer and queer. So yeah, non-binary land. So
Yay!
Hi, I'm Ginger McMurray. I'm on the board as the treasurer. I'm the social media person, and I direct the Dallas group. I'm a trans woman. Great.
Hi, I'm Susan. I am the president of Trans-Cendence International and the co-founder of Trans-Cendence International, and I am married to Finn. I'm cisgender and identify as bi.
So we do have some scripted questions that we're going to go through and answer first. And then while we're answering that, if anybody thinks of any questions that they want to ask, you can just add them into the comments, and we will read them once we finish all the scripted ones. So we'll start with the number one being, what does it mean to be transgender?
So how do we want to go around the room or just have a conversation about it?
I think let's just have a conversation about it, because that way people can kind of bounce off of each other's stuff.
So, to me, it means your brain not being in sync with your body, as far as gender goes. It also, on a more psychological level, means, for me, struggle, self-expression, self-exploration, and hard work on figuring out who the heck I was and am.
I've come across so many different definitions for this.
Yes, exactly.
And so many different ways that people will just use the word transgender.
Right.
I think one of the simpler ones is just where your own identity, which is your own sense of self, doesn't line up with what was assigned to you at birth.
Right. Or necessarily your anatomical parts. Right. Because that's what predicted what you were assigned at birth.
Yeah.
That was the only predictor of what you were assigned at birth, was your anatomical parts. Right.
And for some people, it was the doctor's best guess, even.
Right.
For those who are intersex or just were born with not necessarily discernible genitalia.
Right,
I don't know
right.
how best to phrase that.
Right.
It's usually phrased ambiguous genitalia.
Ambiguous.
Right.
genitalia, yes.
And I would go along with Ginger and say, I think it's just almost like a misfire between your brain and the rest of your body, and incongruence between how you identify within your brain as how your body identifies you, or expresses to the world what you are.
And the research is still ongoing, but the current consensus, and please correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't read anything in the last 6 months, and like I said, it's ongoing, is that your body begins developing based on the hormones in the womb And then in the next trimester is when your brain starts developing. And if there's a shift in hormones, then your body's been told to be, for example, male, and your brain's being told to be more female. And so when you're born, those don't sync up with what the world expects. And that creates a big, jarring discord for a lot of us.
Yep. Or maybe we should just say what, like, certain parts of the world, the current world.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And plenty of...
Depending on where you live.
Yeah. Where you live and when you live and...
Absolutely. How you were raised. Who were you raised by? Were you raised in the church? Were you not raised in the church? Were you raised in East Texas or Central Texas? You know, I mean, even Texas alone, it's completely different in East Texas than it is in Central Texas, than it is in Brownsville and in South Texas.
Let's face it, Texas is the size of several states, so
Right.
that's not
Right.
unusual.
Some countries.
Some countries,
Some
yeah.
countries, yeah.
Yeah, it's a big state.
Awesome. So I can read the next question. All right. How does someone know they are transgender? This is a difficult question.
With this one, do we just kind of want to go around and give
Our
our
own
examples?
personal-
Yeah,
I like
sure.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
Who's first? We can
Go
start
ahead,
on
Dee.
one side and go around.
Yeah.
So for me, a lot of it was just kind of like ambiguous of like, am I weird because I do these weird things? And then growing up in an environment that didn't have the concept of very well of transgender. So things that I would do that would be more in line with my gender identity would be seen as like being told like, oh, don't do that, people are going to think you're a lesbian, because
Yeah.
my family kind of had the association of like, if you're assigned female at birth but you're doing traditionally male things and dressing like a boy and all that stuff, well, that means that you're a lesbian. And that just comes down to lack of knowledge on the matter. And then went through a lot of really not fun things in life. And then only after dealing with all the really not fun things realized that, oh, like, I have always had this feeling about myself, and now I'm going to actually take action on it.
Yeah. I didn't even know. I can honestly say I came out as a lesbian at 17, and I did not see a counselor for anything really until I was in my early 40s. I didn't start transitioning until 42. And I did not knowingly know any transgender people up to that point at all until our pastor at church, who was trans, who I helped hire. So I didn't have any perspective to go by on my identity itself. I know as a child I really did think I was a boy up until puberty hit. What, like 10, something like that? Because I always played with the boys. I remember trying to pee standing up when I was 4 or 5. But I just always thought I was different from everybody. There was nothing for me to go by. I mean, this was in the 70s and 80s. So yeah, and then I started seeing a counselor, and she realized that I had gender dysphoria through lots of counseling and questions. And then it just went from there, and I started transitioning. And everything from my childhood, everything from relationships, everything clicked and made sense. Yep.
So I can trace back, like, feeling some disconnect with at least the like, I guess I can identify like gender nonconformity really early on, but it didn't have the terminology to actually say, oh, hey, transgender, until, what was that, must have been late 20s or early 30s, somewhere in that land. Because before I became a clinician, I just had this concept that like, oh, transgender was still something that was very binary in my head. That, okay, yeah, maybe I can just call myself an effeminate male. Sure, that's fine. And then a lot of people are think that they don't fit in with particular gender roles, expressions, etc., etc. And then in one of my social work classes, actually got to see some interviews with people who are identifying as trans, identifying as non-binary, and it's like, oh, wait, you mean that's not universal? You mean that's because that's me? I thought everyone just kind of thought more like that. Maybe I was just a little more extreme. It's like, oh, okay, it's actually all right for me to be under that umbrella of transness. So yeah, I feel like I could go in all sorts of different directions, but maybe we'll come back.
We have other questions that I'll kind
yeah.
of circle back
I
around
think
to.
it's a huge,
Yeah.
huge
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, I didn't know until much later in life. I knew I was different, just like Finn was saying. I identified much more with the women I would see in shows. I can remember one of the earliest signs I can think of, now that I look back and can see that they were signs, was being at my grandmother. She always watched Young and the Restless and General Hospital and all of those. And I would always picture myself in the scene as the woman. And I didn't know what that meant. I thought it just meant I was a gay guy, which was weird because I liked girls and boys, and there wasn't a word for that back then either. And then all of my friends were girls. I didn't like hanging out with the guys. It just felt weird. I didn't fit in, and I knew it was off. Fast forward 30 years, 25 years, and I was cross-dressing a lot. It was how I could feel like myself, how I could be me, but I had to do it in secret. I had to hide it. It was kind of a terrifying experience because if I got found out, that was it. My family was gone from what I told myself. And then I got with somebody who was accepting and affirming, and she introduced me to Trans-Cendence, where I started meeting people that felt the same way I did and who had vocabulary that I had never heard before, so I could find the labels to what I was feeling. But even then, I fought it hard. I did not want to be that freak of nature that transgender people are always portrayed as. And if you see me looking away from the camera and laughing, it's because Reno has a cat that's running around and is sometimes playing with stuff, sometimes trying to get into food, and it's just adorable.
Same here.
So while I may be a little crazy, that's not a sign of it. But
Yeah, it's almost
only
like
recently.
you know when you want to find something on the internet. I mean, this is kind of a thing, a thing that I kind of liken this to. It's like when you want to Google and you're like, I have no idea what keywords to put in, right? It's like that. You're searching and searching and searching and labels and the words to search for, and have a guide. Then you're just lost, you know.
When I was a kid, my mom didn't want to have the talk with me.
Right.
So she gave me a book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex.
Oh, I remember
Or
that
Afraid
book.
to Ask. And
have that one too.
And that book scarred me for
Right.
life.
Exactly.
And it's funny looking back now, but back then it wasn't. It was
No.
Yeah.
the language it gave. Crossdresser was synonymous with transsexual.
Right.
So when you say you go and you want to Google and figure out what's going on,
Right.
everything I Googled took me to a porn site.
Right.
And
Exactly.
which only more cemented that idea
in your
that
head, that
shame,
shaming in your head.
that I
right.
was something wrong.
Yep.
And it wasn't until I met real, everyday people living real, everyday lives who weren't going to these transcendence meetings so that they could hook up and break out their whips and chains.
Right.
That I realized, wait, okay, this is who I am. It's okay for me to be this way, and screw the rest of the world if they don't like it.
Yep.
Well, and I'm cisgender, so I do not identify as transgender, and the reason that I know that I'm not is because I am happy being identified the way the doctor identified me at birth, which is female. I do have a lot of gender expression that maybe falls into more of the non-binary realm, but I think my essential identity is female, or at least mostly female. I don't think anybody is completely 100% one or the other.
I was going to say female for today because it's an evolving thing.
It's a spectrum.
For most of us.
Well, and for me too, then, you know, I had a very different upbringing because my mother fit more of the stereotypical things you think about when you think about males. You know, she paid the bills, she had the higher paying job for a good portion of their marriage. She was the boss, so to speak. My dad didn't mind that. My dad did the cooking. You know, it was just kind of a very different way of being raised, and my mother was not big on wearing makeup. She was not a girly girl, and my dad was a musical loving guy, you know, so it was just so different from the way that a lot of people are raised. So I don't really have good role models of femininity the way you would normally see it, because even my grandmother, being definitely a feminine woman, still didn't wear makeup. I never saw her wearing makeup. She wore a very simple hairstyle her whole life. You know, she was a woman who had 7 children she raised and 4 grandchildren, so she didn't have time to put on nail polish. She was lucky if she had time to file them. So, you know, it was just, I just didn't have those role models. So, you know, all the cheerleaders and drill team people, I just like, I don't know how you girl like that. I don't girl like that. So that's just not my girl.
That needs to be a T-shirt. Oh,
Yeah, I don't girl
that
like
needs to be a T-shirt.
My mom was a T-shirt and jeans kind of gal, and I
She
guess
also
that's-
knew how to fix the cars. She knew how to fix
Yes, she
stuff
loved
in
to
the
put
house.
things together.
Yep.
And although I am not as handy as my mom, I do prefer to wear jeans and T-shirt. I like having my nails done, but I don't have to have them done. And I really often go, gee, I wish I had that gene that said this is how to look like a pretty girl, because I don't seem to have it. So I have to get consultation to become super girly. When I try to dress up too girly, I look like a nerd. So,
Well, that's
yeah.
because you're not a pretty girl, you're an attractive woman.
Oh, well, hello. Thank you very much. Anyway.
Well, and along, kind of to I'll let you go on. But to kind of bounce off of that concept is like, my mom was never like super girly. Like, my mom, the most makeup that I ever remember her wearing is like maybe some lipstick and maybe some eyeshadow, and that's only for super special occasions. And she was more jeans and T-shirts, except for when she was in a business situation, and then she sometimes wore a dress, sometimes wore slacks, but it wasn't like her big thing. Like the influence of being super girly girl that I had was an aunt who sold Mary Kay for a while, and you'd be like, Merry Christmas, here's some makeup and some makeup brushes, and I'd be like, how do?
Let's see, that's the thing is, though, when you got it, you were like, oh.
Yeah.
See, when I got the makeup from my aunt, who worked at a great aunt, who worked at a Matheson's drugstore in Marshall, I would be thrilled. I wouldn't necessarily know what to do with it. The little samples of lipstick and all I was excited about were the Love's Baby Soft. And then I've talked about that. We remember the Love's Baby Soft from when we were kids. I was thrilled to get it, but I didn't necessarily know what to do with
I
it.
always gave mine to my sister. Or my mom.
I would play with makeup, but not be like, oh, I have to wear makeup all the time. But I did have friends that would try and like peer pressure me into wearing makeup all the time, and sometimes my friends would sit me down and do like a makeover on me, and then I would come home from like middle school all dolled up and like just caked on makeup because my friends were like, oh, we're gonna do a makeover on you, and then they do it and they'd be like, oh my god, you actually look like a girl now. And then I would get home and my parents would be like, what is that on your face?
I
That
have
was
pictures.
pre-contour days.
I have a stack of pictures that my best friend Lisa, if she's out there watching, you will remember this, Lisa. That and our mutual friend Jackie, who sold Mary Kay, decided to make me their model for the day and try. Susan has seen these pictures.
Oh my god.
And I look like a man in drag. I mean, I look.
He does. He's not lying. He really
No,
does.
I look like a man in drag.
He does. They're terrible. I'm sorry. Sorry, Lise, but they're terrible. They're just terrible.
I just no. The most makeup I ever wore was like eyeliner. I mean, there are some pictures out there of me in high school or whatever, but
He looks good in eyeliner, actually.
that I was forced to wear makeup. But yeah,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I feel fortunate that growing up, my parents were a little more subtle with the gender roles, I think, which allowed me to kind of slide through and probably delayed me figuring out being trans for so long because there would be things like I loved my sister's My Little Pony, and I would just brush that tail and that mane, just like, yes. And it was so colorful and just so wonderful. And then one day it just disappeared. I didn't get yelled at or anything like that, just it disappeared. And then suddenly I wound up with a bunch of, this is so Asian, instead of like G.I. Joes, they were like those little figures, but they were ninjas. And I just thought, awesome! It's like, yes, totally. Ninjas, ninja stars, etc. When I would even get like, dolls. I remember there was one that I got from McDonald's, and it wasn't a Barbie, but it was like a female action figure or whatever. It's like, okay, yeah, she's doing flips and ninja flips and throwing stars and stuff like that. So I got to play around with that, and that was just really wonderful. And plus, I was okay with some of the more boyish stuff, and they never felt the push to really, I don't know, push it much further than that. Some things I know that like just kind of were still taboo, so like the makeup, etc., which I got to play around with that at Halloween. I loved Halloween. I still love Halloween. But that's where it's like, okay, yes, I can do makeup, but it's going to be vampire makeup. It's going to be, I don't know, just something wild and out there, etc. Or even with video games. It's like, okay, awesome. The species, like like when you can choose the race of your character, that might break a lot of those gender stereotypes. I was always drawn to those, or the opportunity to actually have a more feminine character or whatever. All that kind of stuff. It's just like, oh yeah, it's just there, and had this permission to just do this, and so. I didn't have the roadblocks, I think, that a lot of people had that, to the point that people start to almost identify with the roadblocks. Like I hear some people talk about like, oh, I figured out I was transgender because these were the things that caused me so much distress. But then again, I don't know if it's across any of your Facebook feeds. There was someone that posted, "Oh, dysphoria just helped me to figure out what I wasn't." But it wasn't until experiencing euphoria that I figured out what I was. And I think that's
That makes
very
sense.
much for
Yeah,
me.
it makes a lot
That
of
makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense, actually. Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, in reality, y'all. I mean, look where we are. I mean, our generation. Just the concept of male, gender roles and female. It's all a social construct. All of it is a social construct. I mean, women are in these stereotypical roles because of when it evolved that way, and society expects to put you in that gender stereotype, that box, simply because of what is on your birth certificate. My family, I had trucks and dolls. I had G.I. Joes, I had race cars, I had, although I will say I hated Barbie dolls and I chewed all the feet off of my sister's Barbie dolls because I was a little jerk.
And I loved
Yes,
both.
I chewed the feet off.
I loved
I
both.
don't know why.
I loved my Matchbox cars and I loved my baby dolls. I liked both. And my parents were really progressive in that they let me have, or I shouldn't say let, they encouraged me to have toys of all kinds and encouraged my brother to. It wasn't that I was playing with my brother's toys. These were my toys that were
Right.
boy toys.
And it was always my sister's toys that I was playing with. It wasn't.
Yeah,
They
you
weren't
weren't
mine.
interested in
It wasn't
them.
because it was an oppressive household. It wasn't that I wasn't allowed to have them, but I knew that it was wrong. Like all my friends were girls, like I said, and I had the opposite experience when they would do the 2 or 3 times they did makeup on me.
Mm-hmm.
I liked it, and I was like, okay, well, this is fun. I can't be the one to suggest we do it next week. That's for sure. Or when we played house, I was always the dad. I wanted my turn being the mom,
Right.
but I couldn't ask for that
Right.
because it was wrong.
Yeah.
Just go through the comments since I see that.
That's it. I think Diana's
Just
the only
Diana. Hi, Diana.
Oh, there's more. There's another one from Diana.
We'll reach out to them to see if they have any advice for you.
About what, Diana?
Well, I think
Oh,
I
hey,
think
my
you
mom's
scrolled.
watching now.
I think you scrolled past
Hi,
one
Mom.
that was right above Diana's.
Oh, was there?
I think so.
Anyway,
No, it's just Diana.
No,
Diana.
okay.
so the next question is, what's the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity?
Ooh, 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 ooh.
Go.
Ooh.
You are right.
Okay, so that my last marriage perfectly encompasses
Oh my god.
this question.
I'm not.
When we got together,
God damn it.
I was not trans as far as I knew. My partner was not trans as far as she knew. And throughout this, my pronouns for my ex are going to change because their identity changed in their minds. And the last I heard, it was gender fluid, and I don't know the pronouns.
Don't
So,
put them on camera either.
pardon? No, I would never out anybody ever. That's
Just being a friend.
yeah. So when we got together, we were a heterosexual couple as far as we could tell and as far as the world could tell. I started exploring beyond cross-dressing and figuring out that I was trans, and I came out. And suddenly, internally, we were a lesbian couple. We hadn't come out to the rest of the world, so we were still a heterosexual couple. When we got married, none of my documentation had changed. None of their documentation had changed. We were a straight married couple in the eyes of the law. Then they came out as trans man. Started going by he, him. Suddenly we were a straight couple again in the opposite direction.
I know, it's so confusing.
No documentation had gotten
Sorry.
changed.
Sorry, I'm trying to find the comment. Go ahead. I'll quit looking now.
Just turn your sound off.
Oh, that's
No document had gotten changed on their end by the time we got divorced. So, since mine had been, what was on paper a straight marriage required us to use the same-sex divorce paperwork because Texas. Yes, yeah,
Wow.
there's a different form.
Really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
Yeah, and
That's fascinating. I didn't
now
know.
after the divorce, I found out that they've come out as gender fluid and are still, from what I understand, exploring. So I have no idea what kind of couple that would make us if we were still together. And even stranger, does that mean that my first wife and I were lesbians? How do we know? I mean,
We could go down this trail for hours.
yeah, it's
Hours.
just this gigantic puzzle box
Right.
that I think really shows that the two terms don't mix.
Right. The short answer is your sexual orientation is not predicted by your gender identity,
Mhm.
and vice versa.
Mhm.
Neither one is a predictor of the other. There are lesbian, gay, trans. I mean, there's lesbian, gay, bi, poly, pan, all of it in the trans world, just as much as there is in the straight world.
Can't forget the eggs.
Right.
And I don't even know all the terms anymore. If you want to send me all the terms, it's fine. Send them to me. But I don't even. We have new terms every day, new
Mhm.
labels, as I say, every day. But one is not a predictor of the other at all. When I started transitioning, Susan and I were a lesbian couple, and the one thing I said, and there's no offense out there to anybody, but I said, do we have to live in straight world? I've never lived in straight world. I don't want to live in straight world. Meaning, I grew up in the LGBTQ world my entire life. I never lived in straight world. And if you're part of the LG community, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So, she of course said, no, we do not have to be a straight couple.
Did that for
But by
27 years.
appearance-
No, thank you.
That's the weird thing now, is that by appearance to the outside world, we are as straight heterosexual as it comes.
Mhm.
To people who have no idea that I'm trans. No.
But that's also the interesting thing too, is that a lot of people, when they come to our meetings, they say, well, my spouse or my partner is transitioning, so what does that make me? And so I have to tell people, so your partner's transition and their gender identity has nothing to do with your sexual orientation. However, the fact that your partner or your spouse transitions may help you realize things about yourself you didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
So the example I give is that I was in a marriage for 22 years to a cis man. That was a straight relationship. That didn't mean that I was straight. In fact, I was not. Then I thought I was a lesbian, so I started dating somebody I thought was female and who turned out not to be female. So then that really confused me. I'm like, well, does this mean that I'm straight? No. But it also meant that given that information, I probably am not a lesbian either. So through that process of dating who I dated, I discovered that I'm actually bisexual. Some people would consider me pansexual because I'm not exclusive of trans folk, obviously. But in any case, that doesn't mean that my orientation changed. I know that there are some people, for instance, who are in a lesbian relationship where one transitioned to male and the other one still considers herself a lesbian, even though she is with a male. She still considers herself a lesbian and she's going to stay with her partner. But that is sometimes why relationships do break apart. It's because the other person's identity, their sexual orientation did not change when the other person's gender identity did.
Yeah, we could go in circles.
That's muddying the waters a little bit.
This is, and I'm just going to say this. The short answer is, it's all based on individuality. It's all based on individual personalities. And if we label and put a box on everything and say, you can't be part of this club because now you don't identify as lesbian, that's nonsense. Because I got that when I transitioned. I got that quite a bit when I transitioned.
Well,
You're going to the dark side. Oh my God. You're a traitor to our community.
You're part of the enemy.
Oh,
You're now
please.
a straight white man.
Come on. Like, are you kidding me?
Oh my God, you're straight Christian white man from the South.
Right.
How do I like you?
Right? By all intents and purposes, I am a politician. Oh my God, that makes it even worse.
You're the enemy.
Okay, then you need to go out and start selling used cars and make
Right? I need to go pitch a tent somewhere and start,
Oh my goodness.
and start
Sit-
taking money from little old ladies. I mean,
Oh my. Oh my.
oh my God.
I think.
No offense out there. I'm just going to keep saying that before I get put in Facebook jail again. I'm in Facebook jail, everybody, until Monday morning.
So I was going to say, to me, sexual orientation is who you want to either romantically or sexually be involved with, and your gender identity is about who you yourself feel yourself to be, as far as whether you consider yourself male, female, or somewhere in between.
Right.
So
I would also add with sexual who you want to be with, but how you want to be with that person.
yes,
Yes, absolutely.
And that's where they can sometimes be interlocked.
Yes.
And that's where those labels can be incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
Where, yes, I think sometimes the power of language and the power of labels is often used to exclude people or
Absolutely.
to hit people with a language brick.
Yep.
But other times it can actually help to facilitate creating that community.
Absolutely.
Being able to say, oh, we are a straight couple, a lesbian couple, etc. It's like, okay, yes, now we have something that we can actually use to describe who we are. When we lose all of those labels, some people would love that. Drop all the labels. But then sometimes that creates more invisibility.
Mhm.
Not having the
Yep.
label of gender queer or of queer, non-binary, etc., I was completely invisible. And that is actually really dehumanizing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And
I agree.
labels themselves, I wouldn't know who I was if I hadn't found these
Right.
labels and been able to pick the one that fit me.
Yeah.
But it's a huge difference between I am and you are. Any label I give
Absolutely.
myself is I am a bisexual transgender woman.
Right.
But if you say you are this, that, and this, that's not your right to
Yeah, that's-
define
Or
someone.
you are this, this, and this, and therefore you cannot be this, this, and this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is really what we hear more often than anything.
Mhm.
Is that, I mean, I get it all the time. Because, for some reason, because I'm a transgender man, I can't be a Christian. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. You know, and yet I hear it all the time. I heard it the last 2 presentations I did. Somebody came up to me after each presentation and said, how can you justify? And I said, how can you justify what you just asked me if you're a Christian? That makes no sense.
Yeah.
So yeah. You are this, therefore you can't be this. And the exclusion, as you were talking about.
Yeah, so like in counseling, I often get people. It's like I don't know what label to use. I don't know
Right.
like who am I?
Right.
Like help me figure out if I'm trans, if I'm bi, if I'm pan, or et cetera, et cetera. And I often have to ask like, so what do you actually hope to gain from that label? How do you want to use that? And I do get some people. It's like, well, so that way I can figure out who I'm supposed to date. And it's like.
Well, you figure out, you don't figure out who you're gonna date. You don't need, use this, right here, this, and this.
Well, and maybe a few
it's
more
plain to
buttons.
see
maybe,
from the outside.
Well, yeah, but still, you know what I'm saying.
Well, yeah. Well, it's plain to see.
Well,
from
they
the
told me I'm a
outside,
lesbian, so I guess I'm supposed to sleep with women. I don't know. I don't really feel that way.
So
Yeah.
in
I'm
my
not making fun of you.
in
I'm
my
just
day
saying,
job,
oh my goodness.
I run a lot of meetings, and I'm noticing that we're 45 minutes in.
And we had 3 questions.
And 3
Yep.
questions in, so we may.
Oh, yeah.
Wait,
I was just
wait,
actually I
reel
was
us
thinking
in,
that
Ginger.
myself.
Wait, reel
I
us
keep
in.
thinking, well, we have 4 hours.
Well, that's
We have 4 hours, y'all. We'll bring out the drinking games later.
Pet the tangent dragon. Pet the tangent dragon.
Right.
Set it
Okay.
free.
And there are comments I noticed that are like appearing and
Oh, there are.
disappearing. So like there was a whole one
Yeah,
that was the
yeah.
legal question, and I saw it and then it just disappeared.
Why is that?
Maybe.
So-
I mean, it could be any number of things. It could be that the person deleted it. It could be that Facebook is just being Facebook and it hates everybody.
It could have been, yeah, it could have been bad. Let's do, next question is, what's the difference between transgender and being intersex? I will let you take this one.
Me?
'Cause you're the medically trained clinician. social worker. I mean, I know the difference.
So just specifically, it was just transgender versus intersex, right?
What's the difference? Yeah.
Yeah. So intersex, yeah, more of a medical term. So usually determined when, like, at birth, and doctor winds up checking genitals if it's conforming to looking like a statistically typical penis versus a vulva, then yeah, usually assigned male or female. If it's something that's ambiguous, that might be an example of an intersex condition. There are lots of different intersex conditions that based on physiology or morphology, so what you see on the outside. It can also be very much internal. So for instance, where someone might be XXY, for instance. What is it? Adrenal hyperplasia, etc. So the hormones going through your body are not typical for your chromosomes, etc. When you add in all of the various different conditions that are considered intersex, it's actually as common as redheads, and there are a lot of redheads that are out there.
And a person can be transgender and intersex.
Mm-hmm.
They can be both. I have a very good friend who identifies who is clinically intersex and identifies as transgender.
Yeah. And also people who are intersex, oftentimes they are still assigned a particular gender.
Right. Or the doctors do surgery, typically.
Or say particular.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which they're working on making that illegal.
Right.
So
I think in some states now it is illegal.
I honestly don't know.
I can't remember. Mo Cortez, if you're watching, please answer that question.
So very important to recognize that so many intersex people really do separate that from being trans.
Absolutely.
Like, so if you're intersex, you do not automatically identify as trans or are identified in any legal sense, or even like in a research sense, as trans. That's yeah.
Do you think that there is a link, or maybe there is not a link, between being trans and intersex?
I know there's a lot of research that is going into that, and at the same time, it's hard to do a lot of that research. There are a lot of people that don't even know that they were born intersex.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unless you've gotten genetic testing done.
Genetic testing,
sometimes when they
Or
do
you're saying external.
gender confirming
Yeah, or-
surgery, that's when they found out that internally there is more than one set.
Mhm.
So
I've just always been curious if there's actually a link between being transgender and being
Sorry.
intersex.
you wanted my thing,
Yeah.
feet under your legs.
I'm
didn't
sure
you?
years from now we'll know.
Yeah.
I'm sure. There's so much research being done on everything right now.
Oh.
Does anybody else have anything on that?
Nope.
Should we move on? Okay.
Yep. Although Diane posted something, I don't know if you want to answer it, Diana.
What'd she say?
Commenting on labels, I think getting hung up with the sexuality they identify as, and instead of letting that describe who they are, it becomes a defining factor. For example, if I was strictly lesbian, I wouldn't allow myself to be attracted to men because then I wouldn't be able to claim that identity anymore.
That's a good point.
Absolutely. That's
Good
a
point,
great,
Diana.
great point, Diana.
Yeah.
Bring on the drinks. Yeah. You want to bring some over for us? Let's launch it.
We miss you, Diana.
So yeah, I think it's can be really important that as you're figuring out labels, there may be a certain grieving process to losing a previous label and a life path, and that's also where we have to think about our SOFAs for internet land, significant others, family, friends, and allies.
Yeah.
Because
Even as a trans man, I mean, I had to grieve losing that label of lesbian. You know, I still hold on to my lesbian card. I earned it. I'm not giving it back to nobody. So, but I had to, you know, changing that label that I've identified with for so long, in my even within my own head, was really tough, and feeling like I was losing that community that I literally grew up with, you know, from childhood through adulthood. That was very, very tough. And now that you say that, I had to go through a grieving process. I did.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Boxes.
and reclaiming too some of the parts of what that meant to you,
Mm-hmm.
without letting go of the being male.
Yes.
Saying I can still claim these parts of myself that other people might consider lesbian, but to me that's just part of me being femme.
Yeah.
Go
Well,
ahead, Ginger.
Boxes are incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
The ones that we put ourselves in when we want to leave them, it's intensely traumatic. The ones that we put ourselves in that fit are intensely cathartic. They're just, these labels matter to us. They shouldn't matter to
Because it
you.
defines us.
Right.
And, you know, I was going to say real fast, in claiming lesbian, as I did for so long, and I fought so hard for that label. I mean, when I was in the military doing Don't Ask, Don't Tell.
Mm-hmm.
I was investigated as a lesbian. You know, I fought that. I fought for my identity as a lesbian. Then all of a sudden, all of that changed within a matter of a couple of years. And I almost felt like, who am I now? I mean, yeah.
And Diane and I were one of the first in Utah to get same-sex marriage.
Oh, nice.
That was
Good
like,
job.
Like with that surprise ruling,
Yeah.
and yeah, we were a part of history. That's like really
Yeah.
important. We were on the news,
Oh.
and now, like, because she's gone through a legal transition, it's like, wait, are we legally like
A straight couple?
Yeah, legally we're not same-sex married anymore.
Right.
it's like,
Well, yeah. When Susan and I got married, we couldn't get married in Texas until same-sex marriage was passed,
Mhm.
because I was still legally, on paperwork, female,
Mhm.
and by my birth certificate, I was still female. My driver's license and all that, and Social Security had been changed, but my birth certificate hadn't been changed yet. So it's fascinating. It's really Anybody else? Next question.
We
Okay.
should probably move
we
on
also
to the
have a
next
comment.
question.
Next,
Do
we have a
another
comment.
I don't know, from Carrie Stroud.
Oh.
I don't know if this has been asked yet, but have any of you encountered any media, movie, TVs, books, etc., that positively depicted forms and transitions of gender or sexuality? It always helps to have the sense of solidarity in knowing someone out there knows how you feel, and in that case, have you seen any that were in the opposite direction?
Positive.
So yeah, start with positive representation.
So I actually want to talk about this because this happened very, very recently. So Rocco's Modern Life got a reboot special. Yeah. And I watched it a couple nights ago, and one of the moral of the whole special is embracing change. And one of the turning points of the episode, spoiler alert, is that Rocco's neighbors, the big heads, their child ended up transitioning to female. And so part of the conflict of the special was Mr. Big Head coming to terms with the transition of his child, and who is like well into adulthood and went on a journey to find themselves and ended up driving an ice cream truck and in the middle of a desert. And
Carrie says, I knew you were going to bring up Rocco.
That's hysterical.
Continue.
Stop calling me out like this. But at the end of it, like Mr. Bighead ends up like accepting the change and all of that stuff, and it's at no point throughout that entire thing is the transition used as a punchline or
joke or
stereotype or
yeah.
any of that. It's very much, and in fact, they have a scene where Mrs. Bighead has found out about the transition, and she's telling Mr. Bighead, "You need to just accept it." And look, I found these adorable shoes in her size. So I consider that to be a positive representation.
I think there are lots more shows out there. Movie watcher. But I did actually. I got to audition for the new L Word that's coming out. That will have 2 trans men in the new reboot. And to me, the character I auditioned for was a politician, or a campaign manager for a politician, and I'm not sure what the younger character is, but it sounds like to me, I can't wait to see it, because it sounds like to me they're just regular everyday people like us, whereas the first L Word, they had Max, who was a horrible representation of trans men. I mean, just everything about him was just the horrible, stereotypical way they portrayed trans or transsexual people in TV or movies in the 60s and 70s. So I'm glad that their reboot is going to be just average, everyday people like us. And that's my hope, is that when we do start seeing more trans characters or trans actors, that they're just playing regular, everyday people like us. That's my hope. So, yeah.
It reminds me of a webcomic that I follow called Questionable Content. It has some trans characters in it. There's wonderful representation that happens in that webcomic overall. And, like, it's, like they're direct enough about it. Like, there was a coming out. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a dramatic, like, okay, now they're going to face discrimination. Mm-hmm. Now it's going, now there's going to be, I don't know, suddenly mixing it in with talking about suicide. It's just
right.
We don't need to have all the
right.
all that drama.
Right.
Because I felt like every time I was seeing any queer representation in movies or books, it's like, and either going to get beat up or that character's going to get killed,
or they're going to or they're going to have to be walking the streets because nobody will hire them, or yeah.
But it's important to bring awareness to, we do face a whole lot of discrimination, and that is not our entire story.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's not everybody's story. That's not everybody's story by far. And that's why I say I hope that the characters are more just average everyday people. Susan and I may be trans, but we're average everyday people. We have kids, we have a home, we have all of that.
We all still have mortgages.
Exactly. We all still have to adult. We have,
Much as we may hate it.
Yep. So
I've actually been playing a game on my phone, and it's one of those where you make choices, like it's a storyline, and you make choices based on what you want your character to do. And I one day was playing it, and all of a sudden it's based on a high school, and they have these students coming from another high school because their high school burned down, and they're introducing one of the characters from this school, and they go blah 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 Cameron blah 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 they. And I was like, did they just introduce a non-binary character in this game without any fanfare or anything? Mm-hmm. And I was like, huh. And then I watched it, and sure enough, they came back around there, and the person is dressed in a very non-binary way. And I'm like, okay, cool. There's nothing in the storyline about it.
Because they just
happen to be a non-binary person. Mm-hmm. There are also people in that same one that are gay or It's not even made an issue. It's just one of those things. It's like as if that wasn't a problem, because it's not. And if that was not a huge part of how they get along, I mean, there's been no storylines about anybody getting on to anybody for being gay, for having non-binary identity, nothing. It's just, it's like no big deal. And it's really cool that they have that. I was really impressed, because it's kind of, other than that, it's kind of one of those fluff things, you know, you play and you're like, oh, this is kind of my guilty pleasure. But I was pretty impressed with that.
But it's so exciting when we see that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Yeah.
Trans.
Yeah.
I know.
Well, and we when we do watch TV, we watch a lot of British TV, and we watch a lot of British TV because they're kinder to each other, for one thing. They're more respectful to each other, and we watch like Great British Bake Off. If there's a gay person on there, they don't make a big deal out of the fact. They just say. They'll just say
he lives at home with his
partner in Shropshire, and they just move on. I mean, they introduce them just like any other couple.
Yeah.
So if we did this in the United States, it would become more just a commonplace thing. If we didn't, you know, when I ran for office last year, every single article started with transgender man running for office. Mm-hmm. Why isn't it Finnegan Jones from Arlington, Texas is running for office, and he just happens to be trans. Here are his policies, but he just happens to be trans. You know, it makes no. Everything has to start with your label and your identity above everything else, and then the shocker to pull everybody in, and it just makes no sense.
And they make a big deal out of not just that, but also disabilities. So when you're on the Great British Bake Off. There was a season where I was watching it, and one of the characters, her hand is not a typical hand, and she was obviously born with some sort of disability in her hand, and it's never mentioned, ever. They never mention it. Nope. I was halfway through the season before I even realized her hand was different than the other hand. Because they literally made note, they didn't give her extra time, they didn't do that, what I call gurg, you know, where they do the glurg, or whatever. It's basically when they make something sugary sweet to make you feel sorry for them, so you hope they win.
Oh, yeah.
Which they do on, like, So You Think You Can Dance and different shows like that. No, nothing, not even mentioned at all. At all, ever.
Because she was just as good as all the other competitors.
And it didn't matter. That was the thing, is it didn't matter.
Right.
You know, they were talking about her as a character, and she does this with her daughter, and she does this, and she does that. Not mentioned. I was so happy. If we would do that with everything, it would just make everybody realize that everybody's different, and that's okay.
Right. But here's the thing. What happens is, just to use my campaign example, what happens is you've already delegitimized that candidate. Already. You have already put a bias on that candidate. You have just completely negated everything else that candidate is about. Like Pete Buttigieg, right? Yeah, he's a gay candidate. I don't care that he's gay. I want to know, can he run the country? Does he believe in what I believe in? What are his policies? I could care less that he's gay. And just because he's gay doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to support him. You see what I'm saying? But you have automatically turned people against him because you said, very first headline, he's gay. You've already just completely knocked out a third of the population. You know? So that's my thing. You grandiose these things when that is just a tiny little part of who that person is.
Agreed.
And it has nothing to do with the way they run the country or run politics or anything else, or cook or anything else.
We do have another follow-up question from Carrie.
Yes.
She says, to stay on the media train, what would you show children to help introduce and educate about gender identity?
There's a lot of good children's books out there now.
I Am Jazz, definitely.
Yeah, and there's also, even for younger kids, there's, I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's like Red Crayon, Blue Crayon.
Yes.
I think it's called Red.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's about a crayon that's red, but identifies as blue.
Right.
And eventually the other crayons are like, okay, yeah, you can be where you want to be.
There's a lot of great children's books. I would definitely say I Am Jazz, because I Am Jazz has a couple of good books out there about her story and her journey. But yeah, there's lots more books coming out all the time for children now. I think, as far as teaching different identities within schools, kids need to understand that there are different ways of living your life. And I think within schools, I think they try and teach binary, male, female, period, even within, whether it's science, biology, history, all of it.
Well, even just the socialization, because I don't know if they did this at any of y'all's schools, but I know when I went to Catholic school, at lunch they'd see us boy, girl, boy, girl.
Yeah.
So you have that socialization of it's very binary.
Yeah.
I think for me, what I would say, because I've worked a lot with children, is you always talk to children on the level they're at. So if they're 4 or 5 and you're trying to explain what trans means, you just say, well, when they were born, they thought that he was a boy, but it turned out that that she was a girl. And you can just say things like that, simple things, that kids understand it, because I remember telling my niece one time, and this was about sexual orientation, but she was like, oh, that's silly. I was watching some commercial where I think 2 boys kissed. She said, 2 boys can't marry each other. And I said, yes, they can. She goes, they can? And I said, yeah. And she goes, oh. Literally, that was it.
Yeah, like,
And it's the way you teach it. It's the way.
It's a matter of fact.
I mean, you felt wrong in wearing clothing, cross-dressing, whatever, because society has shamed people into feeling that
Yes.
way.
there was no
Right.
I am jazz when I
So,
was a kid.
right, exactly. And if we can change the way that we're speaking to children and teaching children, because children are taught to hate. They're taught different. They're taught about the other. If we can change the narrative and change the way we're talking to people,
And it's adults that think that it's about sex or genitals.
Right.
It's like,
kids don't. No. In fact, most kids that I've talked with who find out I'm trans or whatever, even the children that were in my life when I transitioned, they switched immediately. I mean, boom, they switched just like that. They had no problem with it. They asked me a couple of cool questions, and I'm like, yeah, okay, we're good. And there they're gone. And then they never went back. And then the adults are the ones who had the problem, not the children.
Well, if you think about it, it used to be years ago they wouldn't tell children about death. They wouldn't explain death to them. And Sesame Street kind of broke that barrier and decided to talk about death. And they talked about it in a very age-appropriate way by having Big Bird ask the questions children would ask. And so that's one way to do it, is to normalize it by making a part of the conversation in ways that make sense within the conversation. And that's the best way to introduce things to children is to just tell them, but just tell them on their level using their vocabulary.
And don't make it a shame thing or
You
a
don't
bad
have to
thing.
explain something to
Right.
a 5-year-old that you would explain to a 15-year-old. A 15-year-old may ask, well, how does that work for sex? But a 5-year-old's not going to ask because that's not even on their radar yet.
Okay, let's move to the next question. We are never going to get through this.
At 10 o'clock, we'll read the last question off of the sheet.
By the way, that was called Read a Crayon Story.